The mirror did not lie, but it didn't tell the whole truth either. As Maya pulled the lapels of her charcoal blazer tight, she saw a woman who looked like she belonged in the stratosphere of global architecture. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it felt like a structural reinforcement, and her skin, a deep, rich mahogany, glowed against the stark white of her silk blouse. To the world, she was a powerhouse. Inside, her heart was a rhythmic hammer against her ribs, echoing the construction sites she had spent the last decade commanding. This was the morning. The morning where the double-glass skyscraper project would either become the monument that defined her career or the ghost that haunted it. On the mahogany vanity of her hotel room lay the final stitch, a small, silver brooch shaped like a cantilever bridge. It was a gift from her father, a man who had spent 40 years laying asphalt under the Georgia sun so she could design the clouds. As she pinned it to her lapel, her fingers trembled just enough to be felt, but not seen. It was the final piece of her armor. 20 minutes, she whispered to her reflection. The digital clock on the bedside table flipped with a silent, clinical finality. 10:40 a.m. The meeting was at 11 a.m. sharp at the Xinhua Tower. In the hyper-punctual heart of Seoul, being 5 minutes early was considered late, and being late was considered an insult to the ancestors. Maya grabbed her leather portfolio, the weight of the blueprints feeling like the weight of her entire journey. She had spent 18 months living in a state of perpetual calculation. Stress loads, wind resistance, thermal expansion, and the even more volatile physics of being the only black woman in rooms filled with men who looked at her like a mathematical error. She had outworked them all. She had stayed later, studied harder, and learned the nuances of Korean business etiquette until she could bow with the precision of a local. She stepped out of her room and into the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome. The narrator of her own life, that persistent inner voice that had guided her from the south side of Chicago to the heights of international engineering, reminded her of the stakes. This wasn't just a contract, it was the seed for her own firm. It was the proof that her vision, a fusion of sustainable ethics and bold, futuristic aesthetics, could stand in the center of the world's most competitive skyline. If she walked into that boardroom and nailed the pitch, she would be the first American woman of color to lead a major development in the district. If she failed, the investors back home would pull the plug on her boutique firm, and she would return to a life of drafting stairwells for people with half her talent and twice her connections. The elevator doors opened, revealing the bustling lobby. Outside, the gray Seoul sky looked heavy, pregnant with a coming storm. Maya checked her watch again. 19 minutes. The distance was short, but the variables were infinite. Everything on the line, she murmured, stepping out into the humid air of the morning. She hailed a taxi, her mind already running through the opening lines of her presentation. She could see the faces of the board members, skeptical, traditional, waiting for her to stumble. She wouldn't. She had checked every bolt, verified every calculation, and accounted for every gust of wind. But as the taxi pulled into the thick, clotted veins of midday traffic, Maya felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. She had planned for the physics of the building, but she hadn't yet accounted for the physics of the soul. The clock was ticking, and the world was about to demand a different kind of strength. The taxi crawled through the neon-lit canyons of Gangnam, but Maya's mind was miles and years away, drifting back to the cold, fluorescent reality of her early career. As she stared at her reflection in the cab window, distorted by the raindrops beginning to streak the glass, she didn't see the successful executive. She saw the 24-year-old intern in Chicago, standing in a trailer on a muddy construction site, holding a set of schematics that a senior foreman refused to take from her hand. "Where's the engineer?" he had asked, looking right through her as if she were made of glass. "I am the engineer," she had replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. He had laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like a slap, and waited for a man, any man, to walk into the room to validate her calculations. That had been the first crack in the glass, the first realization that for her, the laws of physics were often secondary to the laws of prejudice. In those early years, Maya learned that she couldn't just be good, she had to be undeniable. She had to be a walking encyclopedia of structural codes, a human calculator who never rounded down. The flashback shifted, the memory morphing into a high-rise boardroom in Manhattan 3 years later. She had designed a revolutionary bracing system for a coastal hotel, a move that would save the firm millions in materials. When the lead partner presented the slides, he used the word "we" until it came time to answer the technical critiques. When the questions got difficult, he turned to her, not as a colleague, but as a witness. She had watched him take the credit for the vision while she did the math in the shadows. That was the ceiling, a thick, transparent barrier that allowed her to see the top but never quite touch it. It was built from culture fits and traditional paths, and the quiet, pervasive doubt that a woman who looked like her could possess the grit to command a skyline. Maya's hand moved instinctively to the silver brooch on her lapel. She remembered her father's hands, calloused, stained with the honest grime of labor, resting on her shoulders the day she graduated. "Maya," he had said, "they're going to tell you the sky is the limit. But they'll forget to mention they built a roof over your head. You're going to have to be the one to break it." She had taken those words as a blueprint. Every no became a structural challenge. Every not yet became a reason to reinforce her foundation. She had moved to Seoul because she believed that in a city built on the ashes of war, a city that lived and breathed for the future, her merit might finally outweigh her demographic. She had spent nights memorizing the intricacies of Korean soil liquefaction and the specific wind patterns of the Han River, preparing for this exact pitch with the intensity of a general preparing for war. The stakes today weren't just about a building. They were about the culmination of every late night in the library, every ignored suggestion in a meeting, and every time she had to bite her tongue to keep from being labeled difficult. If she lost this project, it wouldn't just be a professional setback. It would be a confirmation of every doubt she had fought to silence. It would mean the ceiling was stronger than her hammer. The taxi lurched forward as the traffic cleared slightly, the engine's growl pulling her back to the present. The Xinhua Tower loomed ahead, a shimmering needle of steel and light. Maya took a deep breath, the scent of expensive leather and rain filling her lungs. She had spent her whole life preparing to break the glass. She just didn't know that the final test wouldn't happen in a boardroom, but on the cold, hard tiles of a subway floor. 13 minutes left. The weight of her history sat in the seat beside her, heavy as the blueprints, waiting to see if she would finally rise above the roof her father had warned her about. The taxi came to a grinding, definitive halt. Ahead, a sea of red brake lights stretched into the misty distance, a stagnant river of steel trapped between the soaring skyscrapers of Gangnam. The driver muttered a clipped apology in Korean, glancing at the GPS that now glowed with the angry crimson of a total gridlock. Maya's heart skipped a beat, then began to race. 10 minutes. She looked at the digital display, then at the tower in the distance. So close she could see the sunlight glinting off its crown, yet unreachable by road. "The subway," she whispered, her voice tight. "The station is just there." She pressed a handful of one into the driver's hand before he could even respond and bolted from the car. The humidity hit her like a damp shroud, threatening the careful composition of her hair and the crisp lines of her suit. She didn't run. Running suggested panic, and Maya was a woman of calculated moves, but she walked with a fierce, predatory stride, her leather portfolio tucked under her arm like a shield. Descending into the subway station was like entering a different world, a subterranean machine governed by efficiency and silence. The air here was cooler, smelling of ozone, floor wax, and the damp wool of 1,000 commuters. It was the commuter rush, a relentless tide of people moving with a singular, robotic purpose. Everyone was looking down, their faces illuminated by the pale blue ghosts of their smartphone screens, their ears plugged with white buds. It was a symphony of anonymity. Maya pushed into the crowd, feeling more like an outsider than ever. In the hotel, she was a VIP. In the boardroom, she was a contender. But here, amidst the grey and navy suits of the Seoul morning, she was a disruption. People moved around her like water around a stone, never meeting her eyes, their shoulders brushing against hers without a word of acknowledgement. The coldness of the environment was structural, a societal architecture built on the idea of not intruding, of maintaining the flow at all costs. The platform was a dense thicket of bodies. When the train arrived, it hissed with a mechanical sigh, and the doors slid open to reveal a space already packed to the limit. Maya squeezed in, her back pressed against the cold glass of the door, her portfolio held high against her chest to protect the precious blueprints. As the train lurched forward, she was pinned between a salaryman smelling of stale coffee and a student lost in a digital textbook. The pacing of the city felt different underground. It was faster, more clinical. The announcements over the intercom were melodic but distant, marking off stations that felt like milestones in a countdown. 7 minutes. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to center her breathing, trying to ignore the claustrophobia that threatened to close in. She thought of the boardroom, the heated air of the vents, the smell of expensive green tea, and the judgmental silence that would greet her if she was even 60 seconds late. Every time the doors opened, the human tide shifted, a violent heave of bodies pushing in and out. No one spoke. The only sounds were the screech of metal on metal and the rhythmic thumping of the train's heart. It was a landscape of efficiency where the individual was secondary to the schedule. Maya adjusted her grip on her bag, her knuckles white. She was a part of the machine now, a single data point moving toward a destination. She was so focused on the ticking clock of her own life, so absorbed in the frantic geometry of the commute, that the rest of the world had become a blur of gray motion. She was exactly where she needed to be to win. She was focused, she was driven, and she was utterly blind to everything but the door. She didn't realize that the machine was about to break, and that her place within it was about to be challenged by something far more fragile than a deadline. The next stop was her own, but the distance between the train and the boardroom was about to become the longest journey of her life. The train slowed with a final agonizing screech of metal, and the doors hissed open at the station nearest the Xinhua Tower. Maya surged forward with the exiting throng, her eyes fixed on the neon exit signs that pointed toward the surface, toward her future. She was moving with the momentum of a bullet, her mind calculating the final sprint to the elevator banks, when the rhythm of the crowd suddenly stuttered. At the base of a concrete pillar, just a few yards from the stairs, an elderly man stumbled. He was dressed in a suit that had seen better decades, his frame thin and fragile against the heavy current of commuters. For a moment, he swayed like a building with a compromised foundation, his hand grasping at the air for a support that wasn't there. Then, with a sickeningly soft thud, he collapsed. Maya stopped so abruptly that the person behind her collided with her shoulder, muttering a frustrated word in Korean before swerving around her. She looked down. The man was on his side, his cheek pressed against the cold, grime-streaked tiles. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering with a terrifying, vacant rhythm. She looked up, expecting the sea of people to part, expecting a circle of concerned citizens to form, but the machine did not stop. The flow of navy and gray suits simply adjusted its trajectory. Commuters stepped over his outstretched arm, others swerved a few inches to the left, their eyes never leaving their phones. To them, he was an obstacle, a glitch in the morning's efficiency. The anonymity of the station had become a shroud. Maya's watch emitted a sharp, clinical beep. 11 a.m. The sound pierced through the station's roar like a needle. She was late. At this very moment, Director O would be standing at the head of the polished obsidian table, his eyes checking the door, his opinion of her already hardening into a permanent no. Every sacrifice her father had made, every night she had spent over a drafting table until her eyes bled, and every hurdle she had cleared to get to this city screamed at her to keep moving. If she stayed, the project was dead. If she stayed, the double-glass skyscraper would be built by someone else, and her firm would crumble before the first brick was laid. She took a step toward the stairs, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm of self-preservation. Someone else will help him, she told herself. The station security, the next train, someone who isn't holding the blueprint to their entire life. But then she looked back. The man's hand twitched, his fingers scraping weakly against the tile, and a small, pained moan escaped his lips, a sound so human and so desperate that it sliced through the cold, structural logic of her ambition. She saw her father in the line of the man's jaw, the same quiet dignity of a person who had spent a lifetime being invisible to the world. The moral crossroad wasn't a grand intersection. It was a narrow space on a dirty subway floor. Maya looked at the stairs, then at the man. The career she had built was a masterpiece of steel and glass, designed to withstand the strongest winds. But as she watched a businessman nearly tread on the old man's fingers without glancing down, she realized that a building is only as strong as the ground it stands on. If she stepped over a dying human being to reach a boardroom, the foundation of who she was would be forever fractured. With a sharp, decisive exhale that felt like a surrender and a victory all at once, Maya dropped her leather portfolio. The heavy case hit the tiles with a hollow bang, the blueprints of her life's work sliding onto the floor, forgotten. She knelt in the dirt, the expensive fabric of her trousers pressing into the grime, and reached for the man's pulse. The crowd continued to roar past her, a blur of motion that no longer mattered. She was late, she was failing, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she needed to be. The world above the subway tiles ceased to exist. The looming shadow of the Xinhua Tower, the stern face of Director O, and the ticking digital countdown on her wrist all faded into a dull, distant hum. Maya was no longer an architect of skylines. She was an architect of the immediate, focused entirely on the fragile geometry of a human life. The man's skin was a grayish parchment, cool and clammy beneath her touch. His pulse was a frantic, irregular drumbeat against her fingertips. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice low and steady, though her own heart was thundering. He didn't answer, his eyes rolling back as a thin silver of white showed beneath his lids. Maya reached up and unfastened the silk scarf from her neck, a vibrant, emerald piece she had chosen specifically to project confidence in the boardroom. Now, she folded it with the same precision she used for her technical drawings, creating a soft, firm bolster. Gently, she lifted the man's head, bracing his neck and placing the silk cushion beneath him to keep his airway clear. The expensive fabric was immediately stained by the salt of his sweat and the dust of the station floor, but she didn't flinch. "Call an ambulance," she shouted, looking up at the passing blur of commuters. A few people slowed their pace, their expressions flickering with a mix of guilt and annoyance at the disruption, but most kept their heads down. "I need help. Now." Her command, honed by years of directing chaotic construction crews, finally broke the spell of urban apathy. A young woman stopped, pulling out her phone with trembling hands to dial emergency services. Maya turned her attention back to the man. She took his hand, thin, spotted with age, and surprisingly small, and squeezed it. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Just keep breathing. Help is coming." As she sat there on the grime-streaked floor, the cold reality of her choice began to settle in her bones. 11:10 a.m. In the boardroom, they would have already finished the introductions. Her rival, a man who had never missed a deadline or seen a person as anything more than a resource, would be opening his laptop, flashing a polished smile as he filled the void she had left behind. She could almost feel the contract slipping through her fingers like sand. The dream she had nurtured through years of isolation and uphill battles was dissolving in the stale air of the subway. She looked down at her leather portfolio, lying discarded a few feet away. A corner of a blueprint peeked out, a drawing of a cantilevered terrace designed to offer a view of the entire city. It seemed absurdly trivial now. What was the point of building structures for people to live in if you were willing to let them die at your feet? Minutes stretched into an eternity. She stayed anchored to the floor, ignoring the dampness seeping into her suit and the judging stares of those who wondered why a woman of her obvious status was kneeling in the dirt. She spoke to the man continuously, telling him about the weather, about the city, about anything to keep his spirit tethered to the room. She was using her voice as a bridge, a temporary structure to hold him up until the professionals arrived. When the distant wail of sirens finally pierced the subterranean gloom, Maya felt a wave of profound exhaustion. The medics descended the stairs with a rhythmic clatter of equipment, their bright uniforms cutting through the gray anonymity of the crowd. As they took over, checking the man's vitals and prepping a stretcher, one of the technicians looked at Maya, noticing her stained scarf and the way she was still holding the man's hand. "You did well," he said in hurried English, giving her a brief, respectful nod. Maya stood up slowly, her joints stiff and her professional armor ruined. She watched as they lifted the man, Mr. Park, she would later learn, onto the gurney. As they began to wheel him away, his eyes opened for a fleeting second. They were clouded, but they locked onto hers with a startling, lucid intensity. There was no strength for words, but the recognition in his gaze was a silent, heavy debt. She stood alone on the platform, the emerald scarf left behind in the medic's bin, her hair coming loose from its reinforced bun. She picked up her portfolio and wiped the dust from the leather. It was 11:30 a.m. The project was gone. The career-defining moment had passed her by while she was on her knees. She walked toward the exit, her steps no longer hurried. The weight of her history was still there, but the ceiling felt different now. She had lost the life she had planned, but as she stepped out into the rain-washed streets of Seoul, she realized she hadn't broken. She had simply held her ground. The glass and steel lobby of the Shinhwa Tower was a cathedral of corporate silence, designed to make the individual feel small and the institution feel eternal. As Maya stepped through the revolving doors, the pressurized air of the building hit her like a physical reprimand. She was 45 minutes late. In the world of elite engineering, she might as well have been 45 years late. She caught a glimpse of herself in the polished obsidian of the elevator walls. The woman staring back was a fractured version of the one who had left the hotel that morning. Her charcoal blazer was smudged with the gray dust of the subway floor. A stray lock of dark hair had escaped her bun to graze her cheek, and her neck felt strangely bare without the emerald scarf. She looked like someone who had survived a disaster, which, in a professional sense, she had. When the elevator chimed on the 38th floor, the doors opened to a reception area that was a masterpiece of minimalist intimidation. Behind a desk of white quartz sat a young woman whose posture was as rigid as the skyscraper's skeleton. She looked up, her eyes scanning Maya from her scuffed shoes to her disheveled hair, and for a fleeting second, the practiced mask of professional indifference slipped. What Maya saw in the secretary's eyes wasn't anger or even judgment. It was pity. "I am Maya Vance," Maya said, her voice sounding raspy in the sterile quiet. "I have a presentation scheduled with Director O." The secretary glanced at the digital clock on her monitor, 11:45 a.m., then back to Maya. She didn't check the ledger. She didn't need to. "Ms. Vance," she said softly, her English perfect and hollow. The director was very specific. The presentations began promptly at 11. He has already moved on to the second candidate. Maya felt a coldness settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There was an emergency in the subway. A man collapsed. "I had to stay until the medics arrived." The secretary's expression didn't change, but she tilted her head slightly toward the heavy, soundproofed oak doors at the end of the hall. "In this building, Ms. Vance, there are no emergencies that justify a closed door." Maya looked at those doors. They were a barrier more formidable than any structural wall she had ever designed. Behind them, she could hear the faint, muffled vibration of a voice, deep, confident, and punctuated by the rhythmic click of a slideshow. It was her rival, Marcus. He would be showing his sleek, cost-effective models right now, using the silence of her absence as his most powerful argument against her. He was proving that he was the reliable choice, while she was proving, through her empty chair, that she was an unpredictability they couldn't afford. She walked toward the doors, her heels muffled by the thick, silk weave carpet. She reached out a hand to the handle, a desperate, irrational part of her wanting to barge in and demand her 5 minutes. But she stopped. Through the narrow vertical window of the boardroom, she could see the silhouette of Director O. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed, his face a mask of granite. He didn't look like a man waiting for an explanation. He looked like a man who had already deleted a file. The weight of the blueprints in her bag suddenly felt like lead. She had spent a lifetime building a reputation for being the most prepared person in the room. And now, the room didn't even have a space for her. She stood in the hallway, a ghost in a high-fashion suit, watching her career-defining moment happen through a sliver of glass. The secretary cleared her throat gently, a polite signal that Maya's presence was now a breach of etiquette. Maya turned away from the door, the silence of the office ringing in her ears. She had made her choice on that subway floor, and now she was standing in the wreckage of the aftermath. The reception was cold, the doors were barred, and as she walked back toward the elevator, she realized the hardest part wasn't the failure. It was the realization that in this gleaming temple of progress, her humanity was the only thing that made her a stranger. The heavy oak doors finally swung open, but not to welcome her. Instead, the air that rushed out of the boardroom was thick with the scent of victory and the cold tang of ozone. Marcus stepped out first, adjusting his tie with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, a look of predatory satisfaction. He didn't say a word as he brushed past Maya. He didn't have to. The silence he left in his wake was loud enough. "Ms. Vance." Director O's voice was a low, resonant growl that pulled Maya into the room. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the hazy Seoul skyline, looking more like a judge than an executive. The rest of the board members remained seated, their faces flickering with a mixture of boredom and mild disdain. Maya walked to the center of the room, her scuffed shoes leaving ghost-faint marks on the pristine carpet. She stood behind the podium she was meant to have commanded an hour ago. "Director, I apologize for the delay," Maya began, her voice holding on to its dignity by a fraying thread. "There was a medical crisis at the station. An elderly man." "Stop," O interrupted, turning slowly. He didn't look at her blueprints. He didn't even look at her face. He looked at the clock on the wall. "This firm builds structures intended to last centuries. We manage budgets that could feed nations. Our entire industry is predicated on the mastery of time, variables, and discipline." He stepped closer, his presence expanding until the room felt suffocatingly small. "You come here with dust on your sleeves and a story of a stranger on a subway. You speak of a crisis, as if the world should pause for your sentimentality. But in this room, Ms. Vance, there is no crisis greater than a broken promise." Maya felt the heat of a dozen stares. She wanted to tell him about the man's pulse, about the way the crowd had stepped over him like trash, about the fact that she was the only one who saw a person instead of an obstacle. But as she looked at O's eyes, hard, opaque, and devoid of empathy, she realized that to him, those were weaknesses, not virtues. "You have a brilliant mind, the rumors say," O continued, his tone dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than a shout. "But a mind without discipline is merely a hazard. We cannot entrust a project of this magnitude to someone who is a slave to her own distractions. If you cannot manage a subway schedule, how can you manage a 10,000-ton steel skeleton?" He turned back to the board, his gesture dismissive and final. "We have awarded the contract to Marcus Thorne." His presentation was punctual, his projections were rigid, and most importantly, he was here. "Director O, if you would just look at the seismic reinforcements," Maya started, her hand moving toward her portfolio. "There is nothing to look at," he snapped, the finality of his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Your rival offered us a building. You offered us an excuse. In Seoul, we do not build on excuses. You are dismissed, Ms. Vance. Try to be on time for your flight home." The shame was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the very air feel heavy. Maya stood there for a heartbeat too long, the execution complete. She had been dismantled not by a better design, but by a world that viewed her compassion as a structural flaw. She didn't argue further. She knew the physics of power well enough to recognize a total collapse when she saw one. She gathered her leather bag, her fingers brushing the silver bridge on her lapel, the final stitch that was supposed to bring her luck. It felt cold. As she turned to leave, the board members had already begun talking among themselves, their voices low and businesslike, effectively erasing her from the room before she had even crossed the threshold. She walked out of the boardroom, through the lobby of the executioner's tower, feeling the eyes of the secretary on her back once more. This time, there wasn't even pity, only the hollow, ringing silence of a dream that had been systematically torn down. The descent was silent, but the air inside the elevator felt thick with the residue of her shattered ambitions. As the digital floor indicator flickered, 30, 25, 20. Maya leaned her head against the cool, mirrored wall. The elevator was empty, a steel box plummeting through the heart of a building she would never touch again. In the reflection, she saw the woman Director O had described, A woman with dust on her sleeves, a woman who had failed the test of discipline. She looked down at her hands. They were still trembling slightly, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline of the subway and the cold cruelty of the boardroom. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen was a chaotic mosaic of missed calls and urgent notifications from her team back in Chicago, each one a tiny vibration of hope that she now had to extinguish. She opened her messaging app to the group chat titled Soul Project Core. The last message was from her lead architect, Sarah. "Knock 'em dead, Maya. We're popping the champagne at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time." Maya's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She felt a profound, aching sorrow, the kind that settles in the marrow of your bones when you realize that being right doesn't always mean you win. She thought of the years she had spent clawing her way up, the sacrifices made by her parents, and the sheer volume of brilliance she had poured into the blueprints currently tucked under her arm like a heavy, useless burden. She had lost it all in the span of 20 minutes. Yet, as she scrolled through the news alerts, her eyes landed on a local headline about a medical emergency at the station. She closed her eyes and saw the old man's face again, the way his hand had felt in hers, the desperate, rattling sound of his breath slowing into something stable. She began to type, her movements slow and deliberate. "The meeting is over. We didn't get the contract." She paused, her breath hitching. She expected to feel a wave of regret, a voice in her head screaming that she should have just kept walking, that she should have let the machine take the man so she could take the tower. But the voice remained silent. The sorrow was there, deep and suffocating, but it was a clean grief. It was the sorrow of a lost opportunity, not a lost soul. She knew, with a certainty that transcended professional logic, that if she could go back to 10:59 a.m., she would still drop her bag. She would still kneel in the dirt. The elevator chimed, a soft melodic sound that signaled the arrival at the lobby. The doors slid open to reveal the same cavernous hall she had entered with such fire less than an hour ago. Now, she moved through it like a ghost. The security guards didn't look up. The fountain in the center of the plaza continued its mindless, expensive splash. The world was moving on, indifferent to the fact that her universe had just been restructured. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement dark and reflective, mirroring the neon signs of a city that valued the gleam of the surface above all else. Maya stood at the curb, clutching her portfolio to her chest. She had no meeting to go to, no firm to save, and no more reasons to be brave. But as she waited for a taxi to take her back to a hotel room filled with useless celebration clothes, she took a long, steady breath of the damp air. She was defeated, yes. She was heartbroken. But as she looked at her reflection in the puddles at her feet, she saw a woman whose foundation was still perfectly intact. The building was gone, but the architect remained. Maya was still standing at the edge of the curb, the weight of her defeat pressing into her heels, when the atmosphere of the street began to change. It wasn't a loud shift, but a systemic one. The constant, frantic buzz of pedestrians slowed, then stopped. Necks craned. Heads turned toward the street. A long, obsidian black sedan, a car that didn't just move through traffic but seemed to command the space around it, pulled smoothly to the curb directly in front of the Xinhua Tower. It didn't have a logo or a flourish. Its power was in its silence. The security guards at the entrance, men who had spent the last hour ignoring Maya's existence, suddenly snapped to attention, their spines straightening into iron rods. The rear door opened, and a driver in crisp white gloves stepped out, moving with a reverence that bordered on the religious. He reached for the hand of the passenger inside. Maya watched, her breath hitching, as a man stepped out onto the pavement. He was dressed in a suit that was understated yet made of fabric so fine it seemed to absorb the dim light of the afternoon. He walked with a slight limp, and his face was pale, but his eyes were sharp, shards of flint that missed nothing. It was him. The man from the subway floor was no longer a heap of discarded humanity. He was a pillar of the earth. The lobby of the Xinhua Tower, usually a place of clinical efficiency, transformed into a corridor of frozen statues. As the man entered, the receptionist who had looked at Maya with pity grew deathly white, her hands trembling as she dropped into a deep, agonizingly respectful bow. The janitors stopped their machines. The security detail lowered their heads. A whisper rippled through the air like a sudden wind through dry leaves. The chairman, Mr. Park, did not look at them. He did not look at the marble or the fountains or the displays of corporate wealth that bore his family's name. He walked straight toward the elevator banks, his gaze fixed forward, until he reached the center of the lobby. There, he stopped. He turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced patience of a man who had built a kingdom from nothing. His eyes found Maya. She was still clutching her scuffed leather portfolio, standing near the glass doors like a trespasser in her own life. For a long, suspended moment, the chairman of the most powerful conglomerate in the country and the disgraced engineer from Chicago simply stared at one another. There was no warmth in his expression yet, only a terrifyingly lucid recognition. He looked at her rumpled blazer, then at her face, seeing the exhaustion and the lingering sting of Director O's words written in the set of her jaw. "Sir," a voice boomed from the elevators. Director O had descended, flanked by a phalanx of executives. He was bowing so low his forehead was nearly parallel to the floor, his face a mask of frantic, sweating civility. "Chairman Park, we were told you were unwell. We didn't expect you for days. Please, let us escort you to the penthouse. We have just concluded the bidding for the double glass project. It was a great success." The chairman didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge O's presence. He remained anchored to the floor, his focus entirely on Maya. The silence in the lobby became a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the lungs of everyone present. The staff watched in frozen terror, unable to comprehend why the sun around which their world revolved was fixated on a woman who looked like she had just crawled out of a storm. "Director," the chairman said, his voice a low, raspy rasp that commanded the room. "You speak of success." "Yes, Chairman," O stammered, still bowed. "We have selected the most disciplined candidate. A very reliable choice. A man who—" "I did not ask about the man," the chairman interrupted. He began to walk toward Maya, his cane tapping a rhythmic, ominous beat against the polished stone. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He stopped 3 feet away from her. He didn't bow, but he inclined his head a fraction of an inch, a gesture that, in the hierarchy of that building, was louder than a shout. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of emerald silk. "You left your scarf," he said. The sound of 100 hearts skipping a beat echoed through the lobby. Director O finally looked up, his eyes bulging as he recognized the woman he had just executed, now standing in the center of the chairman's light. The physics of the room had shifted. The foundation had moved. And as Mr. Park reached out to return the stained silk, Maya realized that the discipline of the building was about to be replaced by the integrity of the man. The emerald silk sat in Maya's palm, a heavy, damp reminder of the tiles and the ozone and the choice that had cost her everything. The lobby remained a tomb of silent witnesses, the air vibrating with the sudden violent shift in the room's power dynamics. Director O stood frozen halfway between a bow and a collapse, his face a pale mask of dawning horror as he looked from the chairman to the woman he had just discarded. "Director O," the chairman said, his voice no longer a rasp but a cold, sharp blade. "You told me that this building was founded on discipline. You told me that a mind without a schedule is a hazard." Mr. Park turned his gaze toward O, and the executive seemed to physically wither. "I lay on a floor while the world walked over me," the chairman continued, his words falling like stones into a still pond. "Thousands of disciplined men and women passed by. They were all on time. They were all reliable. And they were all useless. They are the glass that shatters under pressure because they have no core." He stepped closer to Maya, his eyes softening with a profound, quiet respect. "Engineering is not just the study of how things stand, Ms. Vance. It is the study of what they are made of. You were the only one in this city who proved to have the structural integrity I require for my legacy." The chairman turned back to the board members, who were now scurrying toward him like ants in a disturbed nest. "The double glass project is a small thing," he declared, his voice ringing out to the very edges of the glass ceiling. A glass box for commerce. Give it to the man who was on time. Give it to the man who can only follow a map. A collective gasp rippled through the staff. Marcus, standing near the elevators, looked as though he had been struck. But for the Soul Rebirth Project, Mr. Park continued, referring to the multi-billion-dollar urban redevelopment initiative that had been a whispered myth in the industry for years, I need an architect who understands that the foundation of a city is its people. I need someone who will not let a structure fail because they were too busy looking at their watch. He looked at Maya, a small, knowing smile finally touching his lips. Ms. Vance, my board will be in touch this afternoon to discuss the lead contract for the Rebirth Initiative. It is 5 times the scale of the project you lost today. I trust you can find your way back to my office. I believe you know the way, and this time, the doors will be held open for you. Director O stepped forward, his voice a desperate squeak. But Chairman, the protocols, the late arrival. The only protocol I care for is humanity, Director, the Chairman snapped. Which is something you clearly lack. You will clear your desk by sunset. If you value punctuality so highly, I expect you to be out of this building 5 minutes early. The reversal was absolute. In a single moment of moral clarity, the hierarchy that had oppressed Maya for a decade had been inverted. The secretary, who had looked at her with pity, now bowed so deeply her hair touched her knees. The board members, who had dismissed her as an emotional distraction, now scrambled to offer their business cards. Maya stood in the center of it all, the stained emerald scarf gripped tightly in her hand. She felt the weight of the silver bridge on her lapel, the final stitch her father had given her. He had been right. The roof hadn't been too strong for her hammer. She had simply needed to find the man who owned the sky. The sorrow that had filled her marrow in the elevator was gone, replaced by a soaring, incandescent sense of purpose. She looked at the blueprints in her bag, then back at Mr. Park. The project of her life hadn't been lost on that subway floor. It had been won. I'll be there, Chairman, Maya said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing off the steel and glass. And I promise you, the foundation will be unbreakable. As the chairman was escorted toward the private elevators, the crowd finally began to move again, but the rhythm was different. The machine had been humanized. Maya walked toward the revolving doors, stepping out into the Seoul afternoon. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, reflecting off the puddles and the skyscrapers in a blinding, beautiful mosaic. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was the one who was going to rebuild the city, one soul at a time.